On an August day in 2024, a wall of pale, choking dust rose up off the dry flats of northern Utah, swept across what little remained of the Great Salt Lake, and just kept rolling more than 50 miles, straight through some of the fastest-growing cities in America. Buildings vanished into a thick brown haze. Cars were left coated in a fine, ghostly, pale film. Parents pulled their children indoors and shut the windows, and health officials issued warnings because the dust that was rolling over the rooftops of Greater Salt Lake City that day was not ordinary dust. It carried arsenic. This is the story of the Great Salt Lake, the largest saltwater lake in the entire Western Hemisphere, and how it is, right now, quietly vanishing. It has already lost very nearly 3/4 of all its water, and as it steadily retreats, it is uncovering something that has been lying silently at the bottom of that lake for well over a century. A vast, exposed bed of toxic mud, sitting directly upwind of more than 2 million people. The slow death of the Great Salt Lake is not merely an environmental tragedy. It may well be the beginning of one of the great public health disasters in modern American history. Let me start with exactly what is happening, because the numbers involved are genuinely staggering. The Great Salt Lake is a true natural wonder. A huge, shimmering, salt-crusted inland sea sitting in the high desert of northern Utah, the last great remnant of an enormous Ice Age lake, and one of the single most important ecosystems anywhere in the American West. But it is disappearing before our eyes. Since the late 1980s, the lake has lost roughly 2/3 of its entire surface area. By the careful reckoning of the scientists who study it, it has lost around 73% of its water and about 60% of its surface, and by the autumn of 2022. It had fallen to the very lowest level ever recorded, some 19 feet below its natural historical average, sinking into what researchers now flatly describe as uncharted territory. As the water has pulled back, it has left behind something enormous, around 800 square miles of bare, cracked, exposed lakebed, an area larger than many entire cities. Now lies open to the sky and the wind, where before there was only water, and the retreat has been speeding up, not slowing down. Since the year 2020, the lake has been losing its water at an accelerating pace, running an average deficit of well over 1 million acre-feet every single year. And in early 2023, a team of 32 scientists issued a stark and sobering warning that made headlines all around the world. If the water loss simply continued at the rate it was going, the Great Salt Lake, as we know it, could effectively disappear within about 5 years. So why is it drying up? And here lies the single most crucial thing to understand about this entire crisis. This is not, first and foremost, a story about drought. It is a story about us. The Great Salt Lake is what scientists call a terminal lake. Water flows into it from the rivers, but it has no outlet, no way out at all, except to evaporate away under the sun. For many thousands of years, the rivers tumbling down out of the surrounding mountains, fed by the winter snowmelt, kept the lake reliably full, perfectly balancing out everything that the desert sun evaporated away. But over the past century and a half, as Utah's population has boomed and its farms have spread ever wider, we began diverting those rivers before they could ever reach the lake, pulling the water off for our cities, for our lawns and our golf courses, and above all else for agriculture, which consumes by far the largest share of the entire state's water. In effect, we have been slowly starving the lake of the very inflow that sustains it. Now, drought and a warming climate have absolutely made the situation worse. The long megadrought that has gripped the American West is entirely real, and hotter temperatures evaporate more water off the lake's surface every year. But the scientists, and even the state's own officials, are strikingly clear on this fundamental point. The primary driver of the lake's long-term collapse is not the weather at all. It is our own unsustainable use of the water. We are simply taking far more water out of the system than we are allowing to ever reach the lake. And now, the lake is paying the price for it. And it is worth being precise about where that water actually goes, because there is a common misconception here. For decades, the message drilled into schoolchildren has been that saving water is about personal habits. Take shorter showers, turn off the tap. And while conservation is never a bad thing, the numbers tell a very different story about where Utah's water truly goes. Roughly 3/4 of all the water used in the state goes not to homes and showers at all, but to agriculture, and a huge share of that, in turn, goes to growing thirsty crops like alfalfa and hay, much of it to feed cattle. Meanwhile, most of the water used indoors in people's homes is actually treated and returned to the system. So the great lever that controls the fate of the lake is not really the length of anyone's shower. It is the vast quantity of river water pulled off by farms across the watershed before it can ever flow down into the lake. Understanding that is essential because it means the solution, too, lies mostly in how the region manages its farms and its rivers, not in guilt over household taps. And that brings us to the exposed lakebed itself, and to the reason that this is not merely a story about a shrinking lake, but a genuinely looming public health emergency. Because those 800 square miles of newly bared lakebed are most certainly not clean, harmless sand. It is a fine, dark, silty mud. And that mud is, in effect, a chemical archive of the last 150 years of human activity in the region. For over a century, the rivers flowing down into the lake carried with them the runoff of all of Utah's mining, its smelting, and its heavy industry. And all of those toxic heavy metals flowed downstream and settled quietly into the lake's sediments, layer upon layer. And on top of all of that, because the lake is terminal and can only ever lose water through evaporation, naturally occurring toxic elements have concentrated there over vast spans of time, left behind and enriched and made more potent every single time the water evaporated away and the salts and minerals stayed behind. The result is a lakebed that is laced through with a genuinely alarming chemical cocktail, arsenic and lithium and mercury and selenium and antimony and copper. When researchers at the University of Utah took actual samples of this exposed lakebed into their laboratory to study them closely, their findings were deeply sobering. The sediments turned out to be more chemically reactive and more toxic than other major sources of dust anywhere in the entire region. The levels of arsenic and of lithium in the samples exceeded the federal government's own safety standards for residential soil, and when laboratory mice were made to breathe in the dust under controlled conditions, they developed real, measurable inflammation deep in their lungs. A separate study went further and identified the single group most vulnerable of all to this dust, young children under the age of 6, whose small bodies breathe in considerably more air relative to their size than adults ever do. And the terrible mechanism at the heart of it all is brutally simple. When the wind blows across that dry, cracked, poisoned lakebed, as it increasingly does, and with growing force, it lifts the very finest and lightest of those particles up into the open air. These are particles small enough to remain suspended aloft for days at a time, and small enough to travel deep down into the tissue of human lungs. And the prevailing winds carry them east, toward the mountains, which means directly over the booming cities of the Wasatch Front, that dense strip of land running from Provo, up through Salt Lake City, and on to Brigham City, where something on the order of 3/4 of the entire population of the state of Utah actually lives. More than 2 million people going about their daily lives, sitting directly downwind of a steadily growing field of arsenic-laden dust. And it is worth being clear about what that kind of exposure can actually do to a human body, because arsenic is not a vague or abstract danger. It is a well-established human carcinogen, linked over years of exposure to cancers of the lung, the skin, and the bladder, as well as to heart disease, lung disease, and developmental harm in children. The finest dust particles, the ones that stay airborne longest, are also precisely the ones that lodge deepest in the lungs and do the most damage, entirely apart from what they carry. And this lands on a region that in the winter already struggles with some of the worst air quality in the nation, when cold air traps pollution against the mountains for days on end. Layering a growing source of toxic dust on top of that existing burden is a genuinely serious prospect. There is also a hard question of fairness buried in it. Salt Lake City's west side, historically home to lower income and more diverse communities, already bears a disproportionate share of the area's pollution and sits closest to the lakebed. Yet the research suggests that the dust, once airborne, does not respect neighborhood lines. Even the wealthier suburbs are expected to take a significant share. When the lake exhales its poison, it does not check anyone's address. If all of this somehow sounds far-fetched, the idea of an entire modern American city being slowly poisoned by the dust of a dying lake, then it is worth knowing that it has already happened once before, and not very far away at all. In the early years of the 20th century, the city of Los Angeles, thirsty and rapidly growing, diverted away the water that fed Owens Lake over in eastern California and drained that lake almost completely dry. And what was left behind was a vast, flat, alkaline bed of dust, also, as it happens, laced with arsenic and other toxic metals. That dried up lakebed promptly became the single largest source of dust pollution in the entire United States, sending choking toxic clouds billowing across the region for decades on end. Los Angeles has since been forced, by court order and by law, to spend well over $2.5 billion trying to keep the Owens lakebed from simply blowing away, flooding it with shallow water, covering it over in gravel, and waging an endless and enormously expensive war against the dust that it had itself created. And here is the truly sobering part of that comparison. The exposed bed of the Great Salt Lake is already more than 16 times the size of the entire Owens Lake bed. If Owens Lake, at just a small fraction of the size, could become the very worst source of dust pollution in the whole country, then the Great Salt Lake, vastly larger, and sitting right beside a major metropolitan area of millions of people, represents a potential dust catastrophe on a scale that America has genuinely never witnessed before. It is precisely why one Utah state lawmaker described the shrinking lake, quite chillingly, as a kind of environmental nuclear bomb waiting to go off. And the poison rising into the air is only one half of the unfolding catastrophe. The other half is the death of the lake itself, as a living thing. Because as the water steadily disappears, the salt in whatever water remains becomes more and more highly concentrated. Now, the Great Salt Lake is naturally very salty indeed, far saltier than the open ocean, but its whole ecosystem is exquisitely and delicately tuned to a certain narrow balance of that saltiness. As the water level drops and the salinity spikes upward, it crosses a critical threshold that the lake's fragile web of life simply cannot survive. The tiny brine shrimp and the brine flies that live throughout the lake, small creatures that most people have honestly never even heard of, begin to sicken and die off in enormous numbers. And that matters far more than it might first appear, because those very brine shrimp and brine flies form the entire foundation of a vast food web. The Great Salt Lake is one of the single most important stopping points for migratory birds anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, something like 10 million individual birds, belonging to hundreds of different species, descend upon it each and every year to rest and to feed on their long and grueling journeys across the continent. Take away the brine shrimp, and you take away the food that all those birds depend upon, and one of the great pillars holding up the entire hemisphere's bird migration begins to crack and crumble. And beneath the surface of the water, strange, ancient, reef-like living structures called microbialites, which form the very base of the lake's entire food chain, are left high and dry as the water recedes, and they wither and die in the sun. An entire ecosystem, millions of years in the making, can come completely unraveled in a matter of just a few short years. And beyond the raw ecology of it, there is also the economy at stake. The lake quietly supports a valuable brine shrimp harvesting industry, whose tiny eggs are shipped all around the world. It supports a significant mineral extraction industry, pulling salts and elements from its waters. And it even helps to generate the famous light, powdery snow, the self-proclaimed greatest snow on Earth, that feeds Utah's world-renowned ski resorts, as cold air passes over the lake and picks up its moisture. The death of the lake would send its ripples through every single one of those things, and it is worth pausing to imagine what a full collapse would actually mean for the region as a whole, because the consequences would not stay neatly contained in any one category. Picture it, the air over one of the fastest growing metropolitan areas in the country turning intermittently poisonous, for days at a stretch, year after year. The industries built around the lake, the shrimp harvest, the mineral works, the ski resorts, crashing one after another. Property values along the shore beginning to sag as the toxic flats creep closer. And, in the worst scenarios that scientists have sketched out, people beginning to leave, a slow outward migration away from a place whose air had become a genuine hazard to raise a child in. As the lead author of that alarming 2023 report put it, the first law of ecology is that everything is connected. The fate of the Great Salt Lake would not be a single, isolated misfortune, but a cascade. One failure triggering the next, rippling out across the economy, the environment, and the health of an entire region at once. Losing a lake this large, this close to this many people, is simply not something a modern society has ever had to absorb. It would be, in every sense, uncharted territory. Now, let me be genuinely careful and genuinely honest right here, because this is exactly the kind of topic where it becomes very easy to slip into pure, breathless apocalypse, and the real picture is a good deal more nuanced than that. First, on the matter of the toxic dust, while the danger sitting in that lakebed is absolutely real and thoroughly documented, the arsenic is unquestionably down there, and the dust storms are unquestionably happening. Some state officials and some scientists do urge real caution about overstating the immediate present-day threat. Current air monitoring, they are careful to point out, has not yet shown a clear and dramatic spike in actual arsenic levels within the cities themselves. So the poison is real, and it is exposed, and it is beginning to blow, but for the moment. The honest version of this story is fundamentally about a rapidly rising risk and a genuinely alarming trajectory, rather than a confirmed mass poisoning that has already fully arrived. That distinction is an important one, and it deserves to be respected. And second, and far more hopefully, this is emphatically not a lost cause, and it is not yet too late to change the outcome. Because unlike a truly unstoppable natural disaster, an earthquake, a hurricane, the fundamental cause here, too much water being diverted away before it reaches the lake, is something that lies entirely within human power to change. And the state of Utah has, to its genuine credit, actually begun to act. It has passed significant new water laws, it has appointed a dedicated commissioner whose specific job is to help save the lake, and it has started working in earnest to get more water flowing back down into it. And nature, too, has lent a hand, an enormous. Record-breaking snow year in 2023 raised the lake's level meaningfully, buying some precious time and proving something absolutely vital in the process, that the lake genuinely can rebound and recover, if only the water is allowed to reach it once again. The Great Salt Lake is not doomed, but it is now caught in a race, a desperate race, between how quickly we can return water to the lake, and how quickly that exposed, poisoned lakebed keeps on growing. And this, as it turns out, is very far from being a problem unique to Utah alone. All around the world, in this warming and increasingly thirsty age, these great terminal lakes are shrinking and dying, from the Aral Sea in Central Asia, which humanity has already very nearly wiped from the map entirely, to the Salton Sea in California, to lakes scattered across the Middle East and well beyond. And nearly everywhere that it happens, the very same grim pattern repeats itself. A lake, starved of its water by human overuse, dries out, and its exposed bed then turns into a source of toxic dust that blows directly into the lungs of the people living nearby. The Great Salt Lake is simply one of the largest and one of the most urgent examples of a genuinely global phenomenon, a stark warning about what happens when a growing civilization takes more water than the land can possibly spare, and about the hidden poisons that can lie silently waiting at the bottom of the very lakes that we so casually drain. So the next time you find yourself picturing the American West, its booming desert cities, its impossibly green lawns, and its golf courses glittering under a hard, cloudless blue sky, I want you to think, too, about the Great Salt Lake. Think about it pulling back just a little bit further with every passing summer, and about the pale, cracked, poison flats that it leaves behind in its wake. For many thousands of years, it simply sat there, a vast silver sea shining in the middle of the desert, feeding the millions of birds and anchoring all of the life around it. And now it is shrinking away, and as it goes, it is uncovering a century and a half of buried poison and offering it all up to the wind. Just upwind of millions of people who never even knew that it was lying there. It does not have to end in catastrophe. The water can still be returned, the lake can still be saved, but the clock is most certainly running now, and the dust is already beginning to rise. And the Great Salt Lake is quietly asking the entire American West one simple and deeply urgent question when a place takes far more water than it can truly afford. And a great lake begins to die because of it. Who, in the very end, actually pays the price? And the answer, blowing on the wind out over Salt Lake City, is a simple one. Everyone downwind.